Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Amy, for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm delighted to be here. I bet none of you know where the University of East Anglia are, do you? Oh, you do? Great. First of all, it's in England. Lots of people in England don't know where it is either. It's in a city called Norwich, which is in the east of England, and probably our nearest main city is Amsterdam, which of course is in Holland. So that's where I'm from, and I'm delighted to be able to talk about the kind of 20 years of research that I've been doing around this topic. Okay. So I want to start thinking about this issue of contact in the context of everything else that we think adopted children need, because I think that's the most important thing about contact, not to think of it in isolation. The child is a whole person. They will have needs related to birth-family contact. They will have other needs. And we have to look at this whole context. So first of all, you know, when we're looking at placing children permanently away from their birth families, they need to feel secure in the family they're going to live in. They need to feel loved. They need to feel that they belong. We know that children say they don't want to be a second-class citizen in that family. They need to feel like they're a real member of that family. But they also have these needs related to loss and identity. Children need to know where they've come from, who their birth family are, and they need to know particularly why they've been separated from their family. Why are they adopted? And we know that when children have no contact with their birth family, it's really hard for them to make sense of these issues and to feel a complete and whole person. There's also those vitally important issues of separation and loss, which for some children, you know, older children, are really overt. They're losing people with whom they have important relationships. But even children removed at birth from their families who never get the chance to live with them, it's still a loss not to be able to know your brothers and sisters, to grow up with your family. So we have to think about how we can help children manage these issues and to make sense of what it means to be in this quite complex kinship network that adoption creates, because we know that although you can remove a child physically from their birth family, you can't remove the birth family from the child's mind or the child from the birth family's thinking. So children are connected to more than one family, and how do they make sense of that and these different family systems? But also, crucially, when we're talking about children adopted from care, a lot of these children will have experienced some of the most difficult and painful experiences that children in our society are exposed to. And children need to be able to recover from this early harm, and that's a lifelong process for some children. So when we're thinking about children's needs in relation to contact, mostly we're thinking about those middle 3 points, issues of loss and identity, that we're trying to address children's needs. But we always have to ask the question, how can birth family contact promote those other two needs as well? How can it help children feel they belong in their adoptive family? How can it help children recover from harm? We have to remain open to the possibility that in some cases it might not help these other issues, it might detract. So we have to look at the whole picture. I just want to say a little bit about the adoption of children from care in England, so you understand everything else, what I'm saying, what the context is like. I think we do have a different atmosphere around adoption in the UK. It's not without controversy. We haven't been perfect in the past, but I think it's more accepted than it is here as a practice, and we've been adopting children from care for 20 or 30 years in the UK. It's one of a range of permanency options, and obviously the priority is to restore children to their birth parents and then to place them with kinship carers. There's other permanent options as well: guardianship, long-term foster care. So adoption is used primarily for children at very much at the younger end of the age spectrum, children who are coming into care in very early life, for whom there is no prospect of return home or kinship placements, and children who've experienced the most difficult forms of abuse and neglect or have been at risk of that. It's about 10% of children in our care system who exit to adoption, almost, the vast majority of whom are under 5 by the time they're adopted. It's interesting here that there's a very strong emphasis on contact in adoption, that adoptions must be open in New South Wales. In the UK, social workers, planning adoption for a child must consider whether the child should have contact with their birth family. They must discuss those considerations in the papers going to the court, but there is no duty to promote birth family contact. So that's quite a different atmosphere to here. Courts can order contact. They can order for there to be no contact, but in reality, courts usually make no order either way. And so the contact that does occur is voluntary. It's agreed between the birth family and the adoptive family, and the court's not involved in that. Most children, the usual plan is a form of indirect contact, a letter exchange that's mediated by the adoption agency. It's probably, we don't record officially how many children have what type of contact, but my best guess is it's probably around 40% of children who have direct contact with a birth family member. Not all of those children will be seeing a birth parent. A lot of them might be seeing a sibling or a grandparent. And there is a duty to provide post-adoption services for birth relatives, adoptive parents and adopted people across their lifetime. And there's a duty for adoption agencies to provide services to support post-adoption contact. And I think that's really, really important. I'm going to talk a lot more about the need for supporting families after adoption. So in your pack, I think you've got some information about some of the studies I've done. The longitudinal study, another study where we focused in on just direct contact and how that needs to be supported. We've also done a study looking at birth parents' experiences of the adoption process, and recently a survey of adoptive families. I'm going to move a bit because I keep getting this sun right in my eyes. That's better. So I'm going to draw on all of these research really to pull out what I think are some of the most important learning points. I think, anybody who needs to leave suddenly or is going to fall asleep, if you remember these points, you've got the main gist of it. I think, over the top, my main point, contact needs to be about respecting children's links to their birth families, but good contact is also about respecting children's links to their adoptive families. It needs to do both to work well for children. I think that every family is different. We need to have an individualized approach to contact planning. We need to think about contact as a relational experience. It's not just a letter, it's not just a meeting or an event, it's about how people relate to each other. And it only really works for children when there's a good vibe to those relationships. And some post-adoption contact arrangements will need support, and I think that has to be there for children and their families. Please don't leave now, even though you've got the gist of it. Okay, so I'm going to talk through these points now in a little bit more detail. And first of all, this idea that every family is different. So in our longitudinal study particularly, we had children with a whole range of contact arrangements. All the families and children in this study had a plan for some form of birth family contact. Over the years, these contact arrangements fluctuated, so we had children with the whole range of possibilities, from virtually no contact at all to maybe quite frequent face-to-face contact with birth family. One of the key questions we were asking in this study as these children grew up is, did the type of birth family contact and the amount of birth family contact that children have, did it have any impact on quite broad outcomes such as placement breakdown rates, children's emotional and behavioural development, how they're getting on in school, their attachment relationships with their parents, etc. These are really important questions, and what we found was how well children were doing in this very broad sense was really most strongly related to what had happened to the children before they were adopted. How old were they when they were placed? What had they experienced before they were adopted? Children who experienced the most adversity in their early life were the children who had the most struggles later on in their life, and that fits with a lot of other research around children's outcomes. And the birth family contact that children were having didn't seem to play any major part in these broad outcomes. But actually, when we looked at when these children were being placed for adoption, we asked their social workers what contact they were planning for them and why. What the social workers were saying, and adoptive parents and birth families really, is that this contact is primarily being set up to help children with identity issues. So we really wanted to see, when these children were old enough in their teenage and late adolescent years, how is it impacting their sense of identity as an adopted person? And this is where we did find an effect of contact and of communicative openness. That the children who had the best developed sense of identity, the most coherent life stories, who felt at ease with their adoption story, children for whom their life story made sense to them and they were comfortable with it, they were by and large the young people who had had the highest levels of birth family contact and the most communication within their family with their adoptive parents. It's very difficult for us to work out what's more important, having birth family contact or having this open communication with adoptive parents, because in so many cases they went hand in hand. The parents who were willing to promote and sustain high levels of birth family contact were the same parents who were wanting to keep a really open dialogue with their children around adoption. For every contact arrangement that we looked at, I think there's a balance of benefits and challenges. I think that's true of so many things in life. Nothing's ever really entirely wonderful. You know, marriage, jobs, everything. There's a balance, isn't there? But that balance was quite different in different cases. So some contact arrangements we studied were very, very challenging for everybody involved, and there appeared to be, you know, not many benefits, maybe just quite a marginal benefit. Other contact arrangements were very easy and straightforward, and everybody felt they were really beneficial, and, you know, just a very minimal level of challenge was experienced. So this is why we have to look at every case individually, because we have to ensure that those challenges are not so much and the benefits so few that we're actually doing children harm. We have to keep a watching brief on that. And we have to think about how we can increase the benefits for children. We also have to recognise that this balance of benefits and challenges will change for individual children over time as situations change, as children's needs change. So, for example, you know, some children in middle childhood maybe didn't experience many benefits to seeing their birth family or hearing from their birth family. But 10 years later, it all made sense to them, and they felt, yes, that this had been a really beneficial experience. So I've already alluded to the fact that these contact arrangements can fluctuate quite a lot over time. We found a lot of contact arrangements actually fell away across this 18 years of our study. And you know, of all these children who started off having some birth family contact, 18 years later, a third of these young people were not seeing anybody from their birth family or hearing from anybody in their birth family. So when we look at these contact arrangements that didn't work, that didn't last, it was predominantly contact with birth parents that was not lasting. The sibling contact, the grandparent contact was more enduring. The face-to-face contact was more enduring than the letter contact. This is really interesting because I think in the UK there's this thought that, you know, direct contact, oh, that's difficult. Indirect contact, that's easy. Our research, other people's research suggests that's not really the case. Indirect contact is actually a very difficult way for people to communicate. It's quite strange, you know, writing to somebody you've maybe never met or only met once about something as intensely emotional as the adoption of a child. When we look at why contact arrangements were not working out, I think first of all, a lot of these indirect contacts particularly actually never got going very well. I think right after a child has been adopted, everybody's feelings are so raw, especially the birth parents. They're in such a difficult and painful place that it's hard for them to respond to the first letter they get from adoptive parents. It's hard for them to know whether they should write back, how to write back, what to say. So often the arrangements just never get going. I think other reasons why we saw contact changing was particularly in the teenage years, where children themselves started to bring in their own wishes and feelings, and some children started to say, well, I'd like to have a bit more contact now. Other children starting to say, I've had enough of that now, I want to opt out of it. For now, maybe not forever. Another reason contact arrangements fell away was that birth parents died, grandparents died. And in situations like this, what people tended to say, particularly the children, is, thank goodness we did that while we had the chance. Thank goodness we didn't wait to go and, you know, look for my mum when she was 18, because it would have been too late. We also saw, you know, when this study started in 1996, there was no such thing as Facebook. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Now there is Facebook, and guess what? People use Facebook. Particularly where there's birth relatives or adopted young people have unmet needs. They want to know about each other. They want to get in touch. Nobody's listening to them. There's no official route. It's easy. They find each other on Facebook. So that was accounting for different changes in contact as well. So I think when we think about practice and how do we make the right contact plan for children, where we have to start is thinking about what are the needs of this child and what are we trying to achieve? What are the needs of these adoptive parents and birth relatives, and what are we trying to achieve from them? That's where we need to start. Where people often start in England is to say, what do we normally do in a situation like this? What's our standard plan? So they start, you know, down the bottom there with a provisional plan, because that's what they usually do, and they don't think about this particular child, this birth mum. So let's think about what some of the benefits of contact are, because I think that helps to focus on what we're trying to achieve. And I think obviously we need to think primarily about children, but actually if there's nothing in the contact, if there's nothing positive or beneficial about the contact for adoptive parents and for birth relatives, they won't sustain it. It won't last. Or even if they do sustain it, it's not going to be comfortable for the children if the adults involved are not comfortable. So we need to really plan for contact that is working for everybody. There's something in it for everybody. So I'm going to start off talking about the adults and then move on to the children. So some of the benefits that adoptive parents in our studies have talked about. First of all, understanding and learning for themselves about their birth family. Adopters have talked about how important it is for them to have that direct connection, not just to hear about the birth family via the social worker, that they can understand the birth family, you know, as real people and see the good bits as well as maybe the bad bits, which is what's on file and in the court paperwork. And adoptive parents are in the front line of helping their children make sense of their identity. And that's very difficult to do if you yourself as a parent haven't got the answers to all these questions your kid's putting to you. So adoptive parents value learning about the birth family, and they say that this helps them to communicate with their child. So obviously it helps you to talk to your child if you've got the background information, but also it helps you to talk to your child if there's something happening, if there's an event. So parents talked about how, you know, they needed to prepare their children before a contact meeting. They were with them during the contact meeting, so they're sharing an experience and building memories together. They're having to talk to the child afterwards. How did it go? How do you feel? What did you think about it? So the contact event is promoting the communication. And if the event doesn't happen, it's harder to start up those conversations, particularly if your child maybe doesn't really want to talk about these things. Parents also talked about how the contact might help them manage their own fears and anxieties. For example, this adoptive mum here, you know, was felt a bit threatened about the idea of her child having another mum, but actually having a relationship with that birth mum helped her to feel less threatened about that. And some adoptive parents really felt that having the contact, instead of maybe what they initially thought, this is going to threaten our family, actually felt it made them feel more of a family. They're sharing this experience together. They're being open. They're standing alongside their child in trying to manage these issues of loss and identity, and it's bringing the family together. So I think we need to tell adoptive parents, not just you need to think about contact because it will help your child. We need to say, look, you've got all these extra tasks you need to do as an adoptive family, and this can help you. I think for birth relatives, the contact's primarily about, you know, that loss can never be taken away, but it certainly helps people to feel better about losing their child if they know their child is okay, if they know their child is having a good life. That's what birth parents and grandparents and siblings want for their child, to have a good life, to be safe, to be loved, to be happy. So I think where contact can reassure parents and other relatives about this, that's the primary benefit. But I think birth relatives also value the opportunity to still have a role in their child's life, to still give something, even if it's quite minimal. And one of the main things birth family members want to do is to let the child know they're not forgotten, they were loved, they didn't just give them away and reject them, they're still thinking about them. So to have a means to do that is really important. And obviously in some cases it's about being able to still have a relationship with that child, with your brother or sister, with your grandchild, with your son or daughter. So looking now at the young people and what they liked or didn't like about contact, well, young people's satisfaction with the level and type of openness they had varied. So we had young people who had a lot of contact who kind of thought that maybe wasn't right. They wanted something different. We had young people who thought that was great. Similarly, at the other end of the spectrum, young people having very little contact or no contact, some of them thought that was absolutely fine, and they said, I wouldn't have wanted any more. But some of those young people were very unhappy. What seemed to determine people's satisfaction is more kind of did they get what they expected to get? So young people were really happy when unhappy when contact didn't go to plan, when they expected that they would carry on seeing their birth mum and that didn't happen, when they expected she would write back and that didn't happen. So I think we have to set up contact arrangements that are sustainable, that are realistic, that are going to endure over time. Most of the complaints that young people had about their level of openness were about gaps in contact. So contact that fell away, that wasn't successful, or about people in their birth family they didn't hear from. And as these children got older, most of this birth family started off, most of this contact started off, it's with mothers, it's with maternal siblings, it's with maternal grandparents, in the main. As these children got older, they started to say, what about my dad? What about my grandparents on that side? Why don't I hear anything about my dad? Some children didn't even know who their dad was, where he was. Case recording about fathers was often poor and missing. So I think dads are meaningful to children, and we need to remember that. Now, most young people, pretty much everybody, was supportive of some level of openness. And these young people kind of had a child rights perspective almost, like it's our life, it's our birth family. Why should some social worker, when we're a baby, decide to cut that off? We should have the right to decide that, not anybody else. So they had this kind of view that there should be something, even if it's a small amount of contact, enough for the child when they're older to be able to make an informed decision about do they want to open that up, do they want to close it down. So that's kind of their overall view. But I think, more than me talking about it, it'd be good for you to hear from some of the young people in our study. So I want to show you a short piece of film. We made a film with 4 of the young people who took part in our study. And I just want to show you a little bit from 2 of the young people talking about their experiences of having direct contact with their birth parents. So Amy mentioned earlier that we'd developed practice resources in the UK. So, do have a look at our website. We've got lots of practice materials on here, and we've got these lots of film clips, adoptive parents, we've got birth parents, grandparents. So I'm streaming the film from this website. Okay, hopefully we can come back to that. I badly want you to see it because they're so fantastic. Okay, so the benefits that young people talked about really kind of came under these 3 headings. Again, like the adoptive parents, finding out about your birth family. Who are they? What do they look like? What are they like? For some young people, it was really about helping them to understand why they were adopted. So some contact arrangements that were quite challenging in a way. For example, seeing a birth parent who was quite troubled, who maybe didn't always turn up, who maybe didn't always say the right thing. Taking a long-term perspective, some of these young people were saying, actually, that still benefited me. Even those meetings were a bit uncomfortable, even though I didn't always enjoy them. It still benefited me because I really understand why I couldn't have grown up with my mum, why she couldn't have looked after me. But, it's good that she cared enough to show up and she's interested in how I'm getting on. That's meaningful too. So, just finding out about the birth family. Relationships. Now, not all of these contact arrangements, young people, you know, didn't feel they'd really developed a relationship with their, say, birth mum. That wasn't a benefit of contact for some people. Where that young people said they felt they'd been able to have a relationship, that was much more in the sibling contact and the grandparent contact. And I think children particularly, you know, can bitterly regret the loss of their sibling, as we heard from our first speaker. That's an enormous loss for children, and they really valued being able to have a relationship with their sibling or have a relationship with their grandma or grandpa. But some of the contact arrangements were much more about these identity needs than relationships. So I think we need to think about, when we're planning contact, the type, the frequency of the contact has to map onto the purpose. If we want a child to have a relationship with their sibling, if you've got a letter once a year, it's not going to meet that goal. Children cannot develop a relationship exchanging a letter once a year. They need more regular meetings to build that relationship. If that's what we're aiming for, make the contact type fit that. And the third benefit was about openness in the adoptive family, that actually for these young people, the fact that their parents were promoting birth-family contact was a very visible sign to the young person that it was okay to have feelings for your birth family, that it was okay to ask questions, that young people really appreciated the openness of their adoptive parents and felt the contact kind of embodied that. The challenges for young people were really around the emotional strain of contact. And I think contact is always going to be emotional. There's always pain behind every adoption. And I think it could be difficult for young people, you know, to hear from their families. Sometimes it was about the feelings of loss at the end of a meeting, having to say goodbye to your sibling again and know you're not going to see them for 2 or 3 months. Some of it was about the awkwardness in the relationship, you know, between the birth parent and the child. So there's that emotional strain. And contact, although it's about, you know, it's often about trying to answer children's questions and manage their feelings of loss, it didn't always ameliorate these issues. You know, some young people felt that contact just brought up more questions for them. Or it didn't answer their questions. Particularly these letters, you know, these letters going back and forth didn't deal with that central issue. Why was I adopted? Often, you know, questions around the birth dad weren't being answered because all the contact was with the birth mum or her side of the family. And some young people felt that the contact they had, you know, maybe when they took it to a next step, when they were older and they increased the contact, that it hadn't given them a realistic picture of their birth family. So, you know, we really have to think about how to address some of these challenges and get good quality, meaningful contact for children. I think in terms of every case is different, that... Oh. Okay, somebody's taking over the computer from somewhere else.
Sorry, they're just going to, can you...
Excuse me a minute.
Page with the video too?
Yeah?
Yeah, so we've just opened it.
Oh.
Yes.
I've had contact with my birth dad on quite a regular basis until I was about 17, 18. First on my birth dad, well, as far as I can remember, since I was 8, is the furthest memory back as I can remember, and it was good until about 4 years ago when I saw him at his worst, and he was quite unwell and quite ill, and that was quite upsetting for me personally. And I think that's one of the reasons why I haven't sort of followed up on any more contact with him for now, but I would like to get in contact with him a bit more a bit later on. Until I was about 17, from the age of 8, he's been pleased to see me, but the last couple of contacts, it was like he didn't really know me as such. He didn't acknowledge that I was his birth son, and that was quite hard to take because I had seen him quite regularly for the past 11 years from then, and it was quite hard to take. But just have to take the fact that he's quite unwell at the moment. Most of it's positive seeing my dad because I've never really called him Dad. I've always called him by his first name, but my adopted family, I've always called them Mum and Dad because they're the people who brought me up and they're the people who have supported me through life.
So shall we go back to here?
Do you want to give him IT?
Yeah, see if we can look at the rest of it. Okay, sorry this is so weird. Okay, so every family's different. Some children have more resources and resilience to cope with some of these emotional complexities of contact than others. And I think when we're thinking about what children can cope with and what contact they should have, we need to look at the history of their relationship with who it is they're having contact with. Contact is going to be most difficult where children are being in touch with relatives who have been involved in their abuse and neglect. That's the most difficult scenario. I'm not saying children shouldn't have contact in that situation, but it will be complex. It's going to be much easier for children to have contact with relatives who've not been involved in abuse and neglect. So this is where the sibling contact, the grandparent contact can be easier. We have to look at the current, not just the past relationship, but the current relationship between the child and who we're planning for them to have contact with. And we have to take into account the child's wishes and feelings, which may well fluctuate and change over time. And we have to think about the child's age, but particularly their development and their general resilience. And I think what we've found in our studies, that children who find life difficult, who are most troubled, who have the most kind of emotional and behavioural problems, they're the kids who also find contact most difficult. But sometimes one of the complexities is it's the older children who've lived at home for longer, who have established relationships, who also have experienced the most harm, who want the contact the most. And it's the younger children who can handle it really easily, who don't have such an immediate need, or maybe don't experience a felt need to stay in contact with their birth family. But if we set it up, it will go quite well. So that's a quite tricky balance to work around. So I want to talk a little bit about contact as a relational experience now, and how complex these relationships are where people meet up in post-adoption contact. And I think one of the complexities that makes the relationships hard is sometimes we set up contact in a way that doesn't feel very natural or family-like, and that makes it hard for people to relate to each other. You know, if you're not meeting in each other's houses and you haven't got all the normal family-like things, shared meals and activities, it makes it feel weird and strange. It also feels difficult because of all the emotions that everybody's bringing into that meeting. And we've got, you know, an adopted mum here talking about her feelings before the contact meeting. Okay, thanks. And finally, these relationships are strange because they are incredibly intimate, but at the same time, they're really distant. So you think of an adopted mum and a birth mum, that's an intimate connection because you're both a mum of the same child. It's really intimate. But actually, you don't know each other. You don't know anything about each other's lives, particularly when you first start meeting, so it's very distant. If we think about the relationship between children and their birth relatives, this can be complicated. When siblings are meeting, they can be very different in age, and that makes it hard to plan where you're going to meet, what you're going to do. If you've got a teenager and a baby, what works for one maybe is not going to work for the other. These siblings will have different experiences and different views and stories about what has happened in the birth family, and that can clash. Their carers might want different things from the contact, different frequency, different ways of meeting. So all that can complicate it. When birth relatives are meeting with their children, particularly when the meetings are not that often, it's hard to be up to date with what the child likes, what they're feeling, what they're interested in, and parents find it hard to tune in to the child and the child to tune in to the parent. Parents don't know what they're allowed to do or say during contact meetings, and they're frightened of doing the wrong thing. So some parents just kind of freeze and don't do anything, which then can be interpreted by the adoptive family as, oh, they're not really very interested. And sometimes, particularly from the adoptive parent perspective, birth parents kind of lack the skills of being able to talk to the child, to get down to their level. They pitch it wrong. They rush in and scoop them up, and the child needs more time to warm up, or they hold back too much. So we need to help people with how to relate to each other. Just some examples of people talking about this issue, and I think just want to highlight this one from the grandmother, that sometimes for the birth family, because of this difficulty relating to the child, but the child's obviously got no difficulty relating to their adoptive family who are also there, they can feel very much on the outside. So we have to think about what the adults are bringing to contact and what their strengths and vulnerabilities are. Contact works best when we have adoptive parents who are communicatively open, who respect and are really genuinely willing to promote the child's connection to the birth family. But we also need birth relatives who really respect that the child is now a member of the adoptive family, and they're willing to promote that connection. And we need people who are really committed to working through these emotional complexities of contact and putting the child first. And these characteristics vary between people, but they also vary within one person over time. And I think one of our challenges in practice is where we're looking at an early stage, what potential is here to have contact, what potential have these birth relatives got to be positive and supportive in contact. We're looking at people at a point in time where they're not showing themselves in the best light. Adoptive parents are highly anxious before the adoption occurs. Birth relatives are highly upset and distressed. So people can look like they're not a very good bet for contact, but they can look very different later, and we need to be open to, if there looks like there's no possibility of a decent working quality contact arrangement, possibly review that a little bit later down the line. And I think I really want to make a strong argument that because some contact arrangements will need support, you cannot close the case and say, get on with it yourselves in every case. That's really, I can't emphasize that enough. Some families will manage it themselves, particularly where you've got very resourceful, confident adoptive parents who, don't mind taking on and trying to help a birth parent who's mentally ill or who has other problems in life. Maybe they have professional experience and they really feel confident and able to manage that themselves. But not all adoptive parents can do that. Where you've got birth relatives who have stable lives, who haven't got too many life problems, who are very accepting of the adoption, yes, maybe they don't need support, but that's really not going to be true of a lot of birth parents. Particularly, I will highlight birth parents who have mental health problems, that, you know, we've got a duty of care to these parents as well, you know, that they need support through this contact arrangement. We have to think where parents children are having contact with parents and there's a history of abuse and neglect. Are there risk management issues? Does that contact need to be supervised? Is it reasonable to ask adoptive parents to take on this supervisory role without any help? Some people will want to do that and feel comfortable doing that, but for other people it's a big ask. We have to think some children might need help to cope with some of the emotional complexities around contact. And obviously their adoptive parents are the main people who are going to help them. But we did find that some of the teenagers, they got to a point where they really wanted to talk to somebody outside of their family. They wanted to feel free not to worry about their adoptive mum and dad's feelings when they talked about their birth family. So they needed a professional to come back in and work with them. And even if we've got a contact that people are managing by themselves, that might not be true forever and ever. So what happens when arrangements need support and they don't get it? Well, the worst case scenario is where you have risky contact, where contact is actually harmful for children, where contact undermines the stability of the adoptive placement, or birth parents are saying difficult or harmful things to children. We need to obviously avoid that. I think what's more common is contact that is unsatisfactory, that is unrewarding, and which people withdraw from. And there's a cost to that. Remember, that's the main complaint for the young people in our study. It can feel like a second rejection if your mum stops writing, if she stops coming to contact, or if your parents stop being willing to keep you in touch with your birth family. It's almost worse than if it hadn't started in the first place. If it started and then it fails, it really feels bad to the child. So we need to try and avoid that. And where young people and birth family members have really strong unmet needs, then they try and make contact by themselves. Without support, they do it behind their adoptive parents' backs, and really sometimes that doesn't go well and can be quite disastrous. I think we have to think very carefully about the situations where contact might threaten the stability of the adoptive family, and some of the contraindications we have to be aware of are cases where children have experienced traumatic abuse and neglect, and they have a very fear-driven relationship with their birth parents, where despite time, despite support, despite help, despite positive contact experiences, birth relatives remain adamantly opposed to the adoptive family and unwilling to support the child as a member of adoptive family. That's not good for children. Where contact is at such a high frequency that it doesn't actually allow the child to have a family life in their adoptive family, to go to family events with their adoptive family relatives, to do ordinary childhood things that children like to do, that they're bound to all these repeated meetings with their birth family, and the other side of their life cannot progress. And where the build-up towards contact meetings is so extensive, and the fallout after contact meetings is so extensive that that is absorbing long periods of the child's life being in an emotionally disturbed state, that they can't function at school, that they can't function at home, because they're too wound up about these contact meetings. In terms of how do we support contact, well, we have to look at the child's needs, but we have to address these relational issues and the emotional complexity of contact. And what I've found in the UK is often the support is very practical. It's like, oh, we'll help you organise the meeting, we'll pay your bus fare, we'll give you a room to meet in. And the relationships and the feelings are not really addressed, particularly the adults feelings. You know, a lot of social workers say, oh, well, you know, we'll talk to the child, but not thinking that actually birth parents and adoptive parents have feelings as well. The other important aspect of contact is to get the risk management right. If the contact needs boundaries and supervision, they need to be there, but don't put that in if it's not required. That makes contact weird, it makes it strange, it stops people relating to each other. If you over-supervise it, you over-control it. So I think we need case-by-case decision-making. We need to understand these relational dynamics of contact, and we need to support arrangements that need help. And thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry you couldn't see the film. I'm really sorry about that. But do go on the website and have a look, and maybe at some point today we'll be able to look at a bit more of it. But they are fabulous, and if you look at the whole film, there's 4 young people. You're only going to get to see 2 this morning, so it's really well worth a look because it shows the variety of contact and the variety of feelings that young people had. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we've got time for a few questions. Well, that's an interesting question. Now, I think in the UK, people are very risk-averse in relation to contact. I think it is, you know, it's really a relatively small minority of children who are having direct contact with birth parents post-adoption. So it's actually very few examples because those cases are screened out. But also, unfortunately, in the UK, people screen out the possibility of contact in lots of situations where it could work. So, actually, I haven't seen that many examples, but that's because only a small proportion of children have direct contact. I think we see it more commonly in long-term foster care, where there is a duty to promote contact, and sometimes really poor quality or even harmful contact arrangements are allowed to persist for a long time without adequate support and intervention. We see it more often there. Yes?
I'm particularly interested in where younger children say, I don't want contact with my parent, keeping it something really clear that contact is still supported. As you said, in New South Wales, it is strongly supported.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, I mean, is there anything written about a framework of making that decision and how professionals best can make that decision? And, where you say, well, contact's going to stop. This is not in the child's best interest.
Is there any...
Again, do you not have a lot of experience with that?
Well, I think what would happen in the UK is the adoptive parents would make that decision, and they don't need to refer to anybody else. And that's both because they don't have an order, and that's both a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because actually what makes adoptive parents really willing to promote this contact is the fact that they feel it's in control, the fact that they know if they think it's harming their child or their family, they can stop it. And that makes them actually more committed to doing it. Sometimes if they're doing it because they're told to do it, they're not doing it for the right reasons and they're not doing it willingly, and it might not be good quality. But where it's a bad thing is, parents might agree to it and actually they're not really willing to promote it and they will withdraw at a fairly early stage, and then that doesn't always meet the child's needs. So I'm really fascinated in the differences between your system and our system, but I'm probably of the view that it's the middle ground. I don't think we promote contact enough in the UK, but I am concerned about you know, court-ordered contact that is rigid, that can't be reviewed. I think there's got to be a middle ground between the two. Yeah. Well, we have a chapter in our report about it. I've got a student looking at it. Beth have published a series of practice guides around social media and adoption and contact, and I think there are more studies coming up. I mean, what we found really is in the UK there's a lot of panic around social media. Oh, it's terrible, it's a bad thing. Actually, a lot of examples we found, it was quite positive, particularly for young people to connect to other young people in their birth family, their cousins, their siblings. That a lot of young people found that quite a natural way to communicate, to stay in touch. It did feel more kind of ordinary and family-like than these sort of slightly weird letters that were going through the agencies. So I think it worked well in the context of an already established relationship or connection where there's a level of trust. It often was a very easy and natural and positive way to communicate. Where it was difficult was particularly where the young people did not have an open relationship with their parents, an open dialogue about contact, about birth families, about adoption, and about social media. So young people looking for their birth family without telling their parents,